Welcome, Sexplorers, to another episode of Sexplorations with me, your host, Adelina Adler. Of course, as you know, I am a JSRD sex coach and educator based out of North Carolina. And I'm joined today by a very special guest. Today with me is Dr. Tina Schermer Sellers, who is an ASEX certified licensed sex and gender feminist psychotherapist, best-selling author, researcher, emeriti professor, and media personality whose expertise spans sex therapy, spiritual intimacy, parenting, and social justice. Her revolutionary perspectives have been expressed on platforms such as Spirituality and Health, Refinery 29, Vocal, Medium, and Bust magazines, along with many podcast, radio, news, and TV interviews. Known for exposing the impact of sexual shame on our ability to securely attach to our partners and instruct our children to attach to theirs, Dr. Sellers' book, Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, Erasing Shame from Sexual Intimacy, has had a global impact. Her latest book, Shameless Parenting, Everything You Need to Raise Shame-Free, Confident Kids and Heal Your Shame Too, was a new release bestseller in 5 categories. She speaks throughout the world on how to heal and how to raise shame-free, relationally confident children. Dr. Sellers, it is a pleasure to have you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I am so happy to be here with you.
Thank you. And would you like to introduce yourself to the audience in your own words?
Gosh, you covered a whole lot there. So my career has kind of been circuitous and it's kind of gone all over, but in all the best kinds of ways. I'm a believer in following your heart and letting things open up as they do. So yeah.
Nice. Good. All right. So, like many of us, I also grew up in a very conservative Christian background that subsequently seeded a lot of shame into my relationship with my body and sexuality. And a lot of that, of course, started very young. So now, while you did grow up in a much healthier, different situation with a wonderful Swedish immigrant family, you ended up becoming very familiar with religious-based sexual shame here in the US. Can you tell us about that process and your research?
Absolutely. Yeah. So part of when I began to find out or learn about the impact of sexual shame and religious sexual shame, I think my response was so passionate in part because I had grown up in a home that I thought was normal, only to come to learn that it was abnormal, if you will,
Yeah.
that I could, we had many generations of people, grandparents, aunts and uncles, parents, who had grown up in homes where sexuality and bodies were a normal part of life. And so as you emerged as a child and had questions about the world and questions about yourself and questions about others, and it included things like bodies and desires and all of that, I could ask anybody. I mean, I literally could ask anybody in my family, and they would give me a very frank, very honest, very loving, very age-appropriate answer to my question in their own little personality. Everybody had their own different way of sort of doing things. But I thought that was common. And I started teaching in a graduate marriage and family therapy program when I was in my early 30s and really hadn't put 2 and 2 together yet. And one of the courses that I taught was a graduate level human sexuality course for people who were becoming marriage and family therapists. It was a required course for state licensure. And surprise to me, nobody else on the faculty wanted to teach it. And
Huh.
I was like, are you kidding? Like, that's one of the funnest classes there are. I still didn't get it. I just didn't get it, you know? Well, one of the assignments I gave my students, and this was actually an assignment that I had as well when I took a similar class when I was getting my degree. I asked them to write their sexual autobiography. Now,
Mhm.
that's a scary thing for people who grew up in homes that were silent or silent and shaming. So I would
Mhm.
say to them, you know, you're only ever as good a therapist as you know where you begin and end your stories and your clients begin and end. You do not want to get those confused.
Mhm.
And so part of how we do this is to look at our own stories from different vantage points. So they had written one in gender, they'd written family of origin stuff already by the time they got to my class. So I gave them about 60 or 70 questions. And I said, these are not there for you to answer every single one, but I want you to look at the arc that these questions ask you to kind of follow. And then write something for me. Help me understand what your experiences have been, what your legacy is. And then I want you to examine if that's the legacy you wish to carry forward or not. And if not, what, right?
Mhm.
And so I started reading these in about 1992. And around the years 2000, so 8 years later, I began to notice this dramatic shift in the tone of the papers. So they were describing still very similar developmental experiences, right? That hadn't changed. The arc had not really changed all that much, but what had changed was how they felt about themselves. So they inserted, you know, things like, you know, I'm embarrassed to say this. I'm embarrassed to put this down on paper. I feel really like I was perverted, like something was
Mhm.
wrong with me. I feel pretty disgusted with myself. I don't like that I feel this, that I want this, that I do this, that I, you know, just so much self-hatred. And I didn't know what I was seeing at that point. And I would go into my chair's office and I would just cry because I'd be like, something's happening to these kids. Like something's happening or something happened as they were growing up, but they're not describing having had, you know, the vast majority, certainly not all of them, not describing having childhood sexual abuse experiences, but their symptoms
Mhm.
are looking like that. They dramatically hate themselves and feel at fault for what has happened to them. And many of them are describing pelvic floor issues, erectile dysfunction, stuff I wasn't seeing in 25 and 30-year-olds, right? Prior to that. So I didn't know. And so I eventually just started asking questions and started to put together that what I was seeing was the first wave of kids that had come through the abstinence only quote unquote education program across the United States, which was religious education
Yes. Yes,
paid
it very
for
much
by
is.
public dollars. And
Mhm.
then there were kids that were also in youth groups
Mm.
that had these horrific experiences of like, you know, pasting together contrasting colors of paper as somebody is telling you how you will ruin your life if you feel sexual desire, sexual whatever, and then ask them to take them apart. Of course, they would all rip, or they'd pass around something they would have them eat or whatever, and then hold up what was left and say, this is what you'll be
The
like.
chewed bubble gum. Yes.
Ah, it's just heartbreaking because, you know, I mean, we can laugh at it on one hand because it's like so absurd, but
Mhm.
the thing that I know is that people metabolized this belief that they would be worth nothing, that no one could possibly love them, and certainly not their divine creator could
Yes.
not love them, right?
It very much ingrains this idea of your utility is so dependent on this, your spirituality, your value. So many of the qualities that affirm who you are as a person
Yeah.
are hinged on this and
Yes.
on going against your body and seeing your body as an enemy. So
Yes.
yeah, people internalize that very much in the way, like you said, that many survivors of assault tend to have that dissonance and
Yes.
like detachment.
Right, exactly. And the belief that somehow they did something or they are something that caused this to happen, right? So that was this is the beginning. And so then I started talking about it, writing about it, seeing if anybody had been doing research on it. This of course was back in the, mid 2000s. And I found a couple of things, but not a lot. So I had somebody who had heard me speak reach out and say, could you write an article for the other journal, the Integration of Theology and Culture? And I said, I don't know anything about your journal. I'll look it up. I'll see who your audience is. I said, you need to know that what I will write is what I'm seeing. I'm not going to come out as some kind of expert or whatever, but I'm going to say, I'm seeing this, I'm hearing this, and it concerns me, because if this is at all widespread, then culture, the socio-political climate of the US and the larger evangelical church is in the process of abusing the sexual development of people. And this is causing intimacy issues, like the ability to attach well in people later in life. And it is serious, and we have to call it out and talk about how to stop it. And so that was 2006. I started writing my book then. I did 11 years of research and writing and published the Sex, God, and Conservative Church book in 2017. Because I wanted to show the arc of what had happened. I wanted to say, well, has America always been sex negative, or was it ever sex positive? Where did this come from? Why? Was there ever sex positivity somewhere, not in Eastern religion, but in some of the Western thought? Was it anywhere? And so I found things in ancient Hebrew writing that was just spectacular. And then I talked about, here's how you heal. Here's what I'm doing with people that's helping them. And then here's some practices that you can do. So all of that is in that tiny little book. But I just thought, I've got to try to put together something that can hold the hand of people and actually help them see themselves as valuable and good and normal and fine. And, and that this was something that they were set up for, not intentionally either, but definitely has had this impact.
Actually, that makes me curious, because I know you mentioned the Hebrew tradition. And I know from my own personal studies about certain Gnostic belief systems and how they viewed sexuality and energy and that forth. But by the time settlers had come here, they were already more along the lines of puritanical thought, logic, and process. So was the answer basically no? Like, what that, I mean, yes, it was always pretty much like this from the colonial settlement onwards. Ooh.
Well, I would say before that, it started in the 4th century with Constantine. Constantine was the first person of power to become a Christian. So he had the power then to appoint leaders to this brand new church. Right. And so what was happening in Christianity at that time, this is mostly in the Rome area, was that the men were vying for power through how they could deny the body and who could deny the body the most. Okay, this is Augustine and others, right? So they are chosen to be leaders of this brand new church that's already a few hundred years old, but this, they're going to institutionalize or make it an empire religion, right? At that point, when the men could not deny these human desires, they blamed the women in their lives, right? This core belief that men are not capable or responsible to manage their desires, to manage themselves, has been around for over 2,000 years. And it's still very much a part of how we do capitalistic culture. We do not hold men responsible for what they say or do, especially around sexuality. And yet they are the ones that start wars. They are the ones that sexually abuse others by and large, right? By a long shot, right? We still do not hold them accountable, and we let them blame the victim, which often is women, not always, but often. And this is still woven into the way that we think in the US and how we teach about raising children and bodies and sexuality.
That actually goes really well into the next question I had listed here, which is what are the broader effects of living with ingrained sexual shame and these kinds of sexual beliefs, and how do they not only impact our lives personally, but society as a whole? In other words, why do you feel that this is such an important issue to address? And I think, like, we already touched upon a few key factors here, like rape culture being
Right.
enabled,
Yes.
lawmakers, decision makers with abysmal understanding of basic body functioning,
Seriously.
making laws that affect especially persons with wombs and
Yes.
uteruses.
Yes.
Um, hypersexualized society that's greatly sexually ignorant,
Yes.
which causes a lot of that distress that you've witnessed. And
Right. Exactly.
goodness,
Yeah.
what else?
Yeah. Right. Right. Well, because we don't have comprehensive sex education, because the vast majority of people don't understand what comprehensive sex education is, like it's relational, social, emotional learning
Mhm.
from 5 to 8 or 9. So it's, do you know that you own your own body, that other people own theirs? When they say no, or they even give a funny look, you don't, right? You ask if you can hug, you ask if you can hold a hand, you ask if you can play. What does it mean to treat somebody with kindness? What does it mean to be treated with kindness? How do you do conflict by using your words and not using violence? Like there's just all kinds of social, emotional, very important learning that goes into that K-8. And then we start getting into puberty, reproduction, and then more serious things like around power differentials and how those are, what that means when somebody has more power over another, and all of that, just get more
Mhm.
complex. And we talk about gender and gender on a continuum, and attraction on a continuum. Like we get to talk about more complex things, but we don't talk about those until kids are fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and it
Mhm.
graduates into more complex issues from 9, 10 to 18.
Mhm.
So in countries that have comprehensive sex education, kids are, as education does, as knowledge does, equipped to differentiate between fantasy and reality, right? Like our kids know you can't scale a building like Superman, but it's or like Spider-Man, but it's super fun to watch that show. Or you can't drive like Fast and Furious movie. You'll get killed.
Yes.
However, it's really fun to watch that movie. We do not provide kids with that same education so they can tell the difference between someone seeming kind and exploitation, right?
Mhm.
And so what we literally do is throw our kids to the wolves. We let media that is now allowed to lie and give misinformation about anything all the
Mhm.
time, right? Because it makes stockholders money, because that's more important to America now than actually doing things that are good for people, helpful to people, supportive to people, children, families, etc. And so they go to media to get their education, and they don't have anything in their back pocket that says that's fantasy. That's
Yes.
someone's fantasy. That may not even be my fantasy, but that's a fantasy. That is not how I would want to treat somebody because of these other conversations I've been having
Mhm.
forever,
It's
right?
like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's exactly that. Like I get so many times people whose only course other than, the sex education that we get here that's largely sterilized and based on STIs and a lot of still abstinence messages.
Well, and it's
Um,
medically inaccurate. 80%
yes.
of it is medically inaccurate. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and it's not required to be. I remember
Yeah.
I put all the stats on my Instagram once, and they're boggling.
They
But
are.
so what they have are peer influences who are informed by the media, like you're saying, and pornography, which they also forget. These are all things that are meant to be entertainment.
That's
But
right.
that veil of fantasy and that separation is
Yes.
completely gone because while it
Right.
seems kind of logical when you take a step back and objectively look at it, it's become so ingrained and the only option that
That's
people kind of default to seeing that as, oh well, this must be the standard, this is all
right.
that there is, and that's
Right.
very unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. At the very least, it makes people really terrible lovers for the first 20 years. They're trying to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And this is primarily in the straight community and the cis straight community. In our queer community, because they don't have something being thrust on them, and because they've had to deal with so much oppression, they start by saying, tell me what you're into. I don't want to make any assumptions here.
Yes, No,
and they
that's
have a
absolutely right.
conversation.
Yes, we had to build it. My sister and I had the same conversation because we were like growing up as queer individuals, we didn't have a model outside of a very sexually exploited visual of like how like women loving women would look like. So
Yeah.
we had to build it from
Yes,
the bottom up
that's
together
right.
cooperatively. And yeah, so you see a lot more healthy, like
Yes.
ingrained, like together. Like, I mean, it's
Yes.
not
Yeah.
perfect, but it's
No, right. Like anything, we're humans, right?
yeah.
But like Masters and Johnson, their last piece of research in the early 70s, which they did all observational research, was looking at queer couples and looking at straight couples and how did they orchestrate an intimate time together. And what they found was just almost across the board was that queer couples built anticipation, spent time talking about it, made decisions to try certain things, it just had more creativity, variety, and more feeling in it. And the straight couples were wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. And it looked the same. And it didn't look connected. Like it didn't
There's
always
no
even look
collaboration.
pleasurable for both,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
The collaboration is completely missing. We usually have
Yes.
these performance-based ideologies, and
Yes.
whereas one person's usually the host that's just
Yes.
meant to kind of be gracious and accept and yay, I love this, and the other guy and the other one's supposed to
Right.
impress.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's very performative. And so therefore people are leaving out their heart and
Mm.
their presence, right? And that's what brings the juice to sexual experiences is our heart and our presence, like, and that doesn't even, we don't even have to be like, madly in love, but we can bring our heart and our presence and have a very lovely experience because we are there. We're not somewhere else. We are there intentionally crafting something we want to do,
Mm.
right? So yes, there are broad impacts of sexual shame, but I would love to speak for a minute about the sort of internal personal
Mm.
effect of sexual shame. We didn't actually have an operational definition of sexual shame until 2017. So the book had
Oh
just
wow.
come out, and a doc researcher who had come to me several years before, and she had said, I want to do my doctoral research on religious sexual shame, but I just spent a bunch of time in the literature. There isn't an operational definition for sexual shame. And I said, well, then you're going to have to start there, and it will be a gift to everybody that wants to build upon it. So thank you for that. And so she did this brilliant piece of research, came up with this definition at the end. And I remember I was flying on a plane home from a speaking engagement, and it just stopped me in my tracks because it was like right there in black and white was everything I had been seeing in people's lives that we were still trying to name what we were seeing, but the patterning was there. So I'd love to read that definition
Oh
for you
yes,
and
please.
your listeners. So this is from the doctoral dissertation of Dr. Noel Clark in 2017. Sexual shame is a visceral feeling, so it's in your body, right? Visceral feeling of humiliation and disgust toward one's own body and identity as a sexual being, and a belief of being abnormal, inferior, and unworthy. This feeling can be internalized, but it also manifests in interpersonal relationships. And I would say that's where it begins. It begins with the year-old who's finding their vulva or their penis for the first time, and somebody loses it on them and then does every other time after that, right? So it begins in interpersonal relationships, having a negative impact on trust, communication, and physical and emotional intimacy. So it hits every area of our attachment. It's crazy. Sexual shame develops across the lifespan, like I just said, in interactions with interpersonal relationships, but then one's culture and society that tells you you're not enough, right? And creates a subsequent critical self-appraisal. So a feedback loop, the inner critic, right? That then just walks with us every moment of every day after that point and makes being happy really difficult. There is also a fear and uncertainty related to one's power or right to make decisions, including safety decisions related to sexual encounters, along with an internalized judgment toward one's own sexual desire. So I like to say that this last piece here, Peggy Ornstein in her book, Girls and Sex, interviewed 80 girls, 15 to 22. And she found that so many of them felt competent in every area of their life until they got ready to go out. And then they were putting down 3, 4, and 5 shots of hard liquor because they didn't know if they could keep themselves safe or if they had the right to. So these were not kids from a religious background. These were just kids who grew up in this same time in history. And it shows the breadth or the impact of sexual shame in this country, that we have a rape culture that we've been cultivating now for almost 50 years, to the point that both or all genders are feeling it to some degree. And especially those kids who are straight are incredibly confused on where the lines are and what they have the right to, right? And so we've got boys stepping over the line, creating hurtful situations that they don't intend to or mean to. Some do, obviously, but there are many, many that are just like clueless. You know, they're reaching over in the middle of the night to prompt something that she doesn't feel she can say no to. Right. And so we have all this stuff happening because we've raised them both in this culture of sexual shame that is rampant. Yeah. It's, I think if we decided how to hurt people the most, we would go after sexual shame. And yet that's exactly what we're doing as a country. So we impact people's ability to do connection and pleasure, attachment, safety, happiness, joy, right? We impact them and they're not waking up from it until they're in their 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Also trust,
Yeah.
inability to trust yourself, like that was the last line there, and trust others around you, and not having the certainty of what tools that you can equip to foster that.
That's right.
It's all lacking. Like we
It's
have
all
been
lacking.
given all these wounds and no bandages.
No, exactly. That's exactly right. And sometimes not even the ability to understand the wound itself. Right. We're like, oh, I must have done something. I shouldn't have worn that. Or I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or no, honey, no, we set you up for this. It's a systemic problem. And we set you up to be hurt and to hurt.
Yeah. We don't teach them about, like arousal non-concordance and how your body can respond in ways you don't necessarily want to, or vice versa. We don't teach them about, we learn about the fawning response, but then you feel guilty for having a very natural biological response.
Yeah, exactly.
In so many ways, it is turning something that's otherwise meant to be a beautiful collaborative experience and just demonizing it essentially. And that's
absolutely
awful.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking when the capacity for human connection can be such a healing element in our life. When there's safety, when there's trust, when there's ability to communicate and really listen and honor, right, yourself and each other, take time, all of that. These are all skills we can teach. They're all skills that children are capable of learning and we can reinforce through the lifespan. And we don't. We don't. We have 18 states that require medically accurate sex education of any kind. 18 out of all of them who have passed laws. That's it.
Wow. And I remember watching a mini documentary on YouTube that was basically called Sex Ed, but like in parentheses. And the teacher there was speaking on the same thing, on comprehensive sex education early on. And she said, we can simply call it human relations, because that is what we're teaching people to do, is to have healthy interactions with themselves and with each other. And I wonder sometimes if it has to do with fostering this idea of very toxic independence that keeps us from each other as well. Like, I think it all feeds into each other in a very unhealthy way. But now that we know and understand, hopefully at a very good degree, how harmful and how important it is to address sexual shame and to dismantle it as best as
Mm,
we can and avoid it. Um, this leads me to the second half of our interview today, where I wanted to discuss your latest book on shameless parenting. Because I know there are a lot of people out there, whether they're already parents or planning on becoming parents, like me,
sure.
teachers,
Yeah.
or maybe they're
Yeah.
just role models, to
Yeah.
you.
Right.
Who,
Exactly.
yeah, we never had a good model to pull from when it
Right.
comes to
Exactly.
teaching kids
Right.
about sex and their bodies and all of that stuff. So, if you wanted to go down this path and you're already an adult, how how do you start this process? What is like the pre-work homework
Yeah.
that you
Well,
have to do?
it's funny because the book came about because I had so many people who had read my first book and said, okay, that was really helpful. I can see now what I couldn't see before. I have young people in my life. I have children of my own, nieces, nephews, whatever. I don't want to do to them what was done to me. Can you help me? And I said, yes, I will put together a book that will help you. And I said, I'm going to make the book divided into age brackets so that you can learn child development on top of it, right? So birth to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, up to 18, right? And I will tell you, what are the emotional tasks kids are tending to try to accomplish? What are the behavioral manifestations of those tasks? Like the no at the 2 or whatever. What's the behavioral manifestations? What are the body and sensuality curiosities and relationship curiosities that are emerging at that stage, in each stage? And then what is needed from you in order to help them both see that as good and normal and learn how to manage it, learn how to have discipline or whatever it is that they're needing. And I will tell you the top books for kids at that age and the top books for parents at that age. And I will tell you the top websites. And I've been updating it every 2 years. But here's the surprise that happened with that book. While I hear from parents all the time, they're like, oh man, this is so helpful. All I got to do is be where my kid is, read that, get those books in the library, all of that, and then just go one step ahead. Just be 2 years ahead. That's all I got to do. And I got you right there to help me. And I'm like, yes. And then just email me if you need anything else, right? But I've been hearing from people who don't have kids of their own. And they're like, I have been allowed to reparent myself by going through this book, going and getting the books at the library, reading them to myself, pretending you're 2, you're 4, you're 6, you're 8, you're 10. Imagine somebody reading this to you. And in the book, because it's about healing yourself too, I ask, what do you think you got at this age? And if you didn't get what you thought you could have gotten or would have liked to have gotten, what would it have been like if somebody was reading these books to you? What difference do you think? And so people are actually doing their own reparenting of themselves by just walking through the book and going step by step, stage by stage. They're getting the language, they're getting it, said in the way that's right for a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 12-year-old or whatever. And people are just like I'm hearing from so many people, and they're just loving the opportunity to do this for themselves.
I
Yeah.
love that.
So that's how
I,
I just think that book has served that purpose, even though it wasn't my original intent, but it just delights my soul to no end.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense because, well, even after I wrote that question initially, the first answer that came to mind is, well, you probably need to do internal reflection work because, like you said, we were raised in this hazardous environment. We have these messages internalized, and sometimes, no matter how objective we try to be, no matter how much we try to correct for this or prepare, there are going to be moments that blindside us, and
Yes.
we're going to be like, oh, what do I do now? uh, and so a part of that, I think, yeah, is doing that reflection work. I did look at in your website the sexual reclamation project
Yes.
worksheet, and I think that's such a powerful tool to start with for
Yes.
listeners. Basically, it's a 3-part narrative project that's meant to guide people through all the messages they received, the influences that they received from their parents, from their a general environment
Yeah.
through childhood, adolescence, and after leaving their home. And examine how those family attitudes have lingered. And then, most importantly, whether you want to keep that or
Yes.
you want to
Yeah.
step away and
Right.
make that change intentionally, um,
Exactly.
which is wonderful.
Yeah. That's
So,
very similar to what I ask my students to do.
yeah, my clients too.
And they would tell me, of all the 300 papers I wrote in grad school, that was the hardest and the most important and the most liberating. And
Yes,
that's why I worked with it to turn it into something that the general public could use too if they wanted.
I love that. So what are some important things to keep in mind when approaching these topics for both ourselves and children? And alternatively, like, what should we avoid? Like, what are good things to kind of hold on to? And what are things we want to kind of stay away from, like specific language or specific behaviors that may come up
Well,
almost instinctually?
yeah. So behaviors that you want to try to avoid that come up instinctually often are behaviors, thoughts, words, expressions that come from our own shame,
Mm,
right? And so we do a and our face and we stiffen up, and kids are so incredibly perceptive. They just read us like a book.
mhm,
So I had a friend one time say to me, what I've been doing for myself is whenever I can feel it in my gut, I make my face do a happy face. And
I
I
like that.
just take a deep breath. And she said, it's been working. It's hard, but it's been working. She said, because I grew up with all that stuff. And so my instinct is to react.
Mm,
So I've gotten to a point where I can notice the instinct, take a deep breath, and put on a smiling face and say, what an interesting idea. Can you tell me more? Or just some very basic kind of thing while she's calming down. So I would say that's what you try to do. And then understand that kids are very much developmentally right where they are. They're doing what I used to say when my kids were growing up, you're fulfilling your job description. 15-year-olds aren't supposed to love cleaning their room or whatever. Like, honey, I get it. And there are things we do as a family or whatever. Like to learn not to blame your kids for being kids because they're just doing what kids do. Also, don't take it personally. They're
mhm,
also just doing, it's not because of you that they're being a pill and they're pushing against you. They need boundaries.
mm,
They need to know they're safe. And they know they're safe when they know someone who has more power and who is loving is holding the bar, just saying, you can push right up next to me, but I'm not going to let you push beyond me because you're not ready for that quite yet.
mm.
Right? You just sort of gently, with compassion on yourself, compassion for them, practice respect and loving kindness. I used to, and I actually did some writing on this. There's an acronym that I use called ORCA,
Mm.
and it stands for openness, respect, curiosity, and accountability to my power, my ability to hurt people. And I would say to parents, and I would say anytime you're in a reactive situation, try to practice that. Try to practice openness. I think I know what that means, but I don't know what you mean. Respect. You are a human. You deserve respect. I can treat you with respect. Curiosity. I want to understand better your perspective. And then accountability. If I have power in the relationship that I'm working in right then, I want to be accountable to that power. And whether I feel it or not is irrelevant. I have it. So therefore, I have the ability to hurt if I don't mean to. So I need to be extra careful. So I say to people, be kind and loving and gentle with yourself, but practice ORCA if you can, because it will help your parenting. It'll help any challenging relationship you have, and it'll help you to keep growing.
That's wonderful. I wrote that down because that's something that we should all keep. I definitely agree to be wary about projecting your own insecurities and shame and intent onto your children because they're not at the same cognitive level that
Yeah.
you're at. They're not acting with, more than likely, with that intention that you're perceiving. Um, while speaking, I had a scenario come to mind. I was like, all right, well, what if I'm hanging out at home and my little child is suddenly, and then there's a family gathering, because there's a difference when it's just the family unit, you people who understand, and maybe you have guests over, because that's when shame really gets triggered, because you're here under the scrutiny of other people. So say you're having a house meeting and suddenly your 4-year-old runs around naked covered in paint
Yes, yes,
and
yes.
starts like diddling their bits, and you're like,
Yeah, right. Well, and I think, is that in their job description? Yeah, probably. Absolutely. I had my two granddaughters who are 3 and 6 jumping on a new couch that we have. And one of them, they were both in their underwear. And then one of them decided she wants to take all her clothes off. I mean, it's like, this is what kids do. And I'm of the belief, honey, you love that and do that as long as you can, because you will spend the majority of your life afraid to do that. So
yeah.
I want you to do that. So let's just say they do that. That's a great example. People are going to look to you and your response.
Mm. I
Right.
was thinking
And
about like there, because a lot of people will have their own reactions too, that you also have to kind of police for them. And also, as someone who comes understanding a lot of not so pleasant encounters, especially when it comes to, say, older gentlemen and younger, like, femme presenting
yes,
people, things like that, there's a fear that
yes,
pops up in your head, like, don't you look at him like that, like.
no,
So how do you
right,
account for all
exactly.
of that?
Yeah. So the first thing is, know that they're just being kids. The second thing is, trust your ability to protect your child. You're in the environment. Nothing is going to happen out of your watch. Nothing. Right. So I don't need to worry. Bodies are bodies. We all have them. Right. I'm going to be more worried about paint on the furniture than I am going to be on anything, honestly. And so it's like, look at you, you silly goose. We need to get you in the bath. Let's go run a bathtub. I'll be right back, everyone. This one needs to get the paint off their body, or we're going to have a decorated house any moment. Look, so it's not that they're naked. There's nothing wrong with that. That's beautiful. There's nothing wrong with the fact that they painted their bodies. That's wonderful and beautiful. It might be a problem for the cleaning that might have to happen. And so, and I actually had this very almost exact scenario happen with my daughter and my granddaughter, or my goddaughter, when they were 4, and their bedroom was off the kitchen, and my goddaughter's mom, was one of my best friends, was there, and all of a sudden we both looked at each other and we said, "It's been a little too quiet in there." And so we go in and the door's almost, shut, not quite, and we open and we look, and they're stark naked. They've gotten into the older brother's markers that are, like, fortunately washable, and they've colored each other and they've colored the walls. Right. And we both went, well, look at you. And we are running a bath right now. And to this day, I am sad that I didn't think to grab the camera, just because we tell this story, like, you guys were being perfectly you, and it was a mess. you
Messes
know
can be cleaned. Messes can be
Messes
cleaned.
can be clean, but, like, try to see the delight and the innocence in children and learn from it. Learn how that got stolen from us. When did that get stolen from us? Because there is absolutely nothing wrong with celebrating yourself, celebrating your body, celebrating sensation, right? Color, vision, all of it. It's a gift of being human, but we wipe it away in adolescence often. So,
Yeah. Speaking of adolescence, I know that especially during middle school years, I made a point to try to remember as hard as I could. I kept journals so diligently, and in them I wrote, "Please remember what it was like at this moment." And
yes.
part of it I remember was so much pressure. Like, that is one of the most transitional points where you are measuring yourself to your peers, and that's when parents kind of become uncool. So,
Right.
what if my kids don't want to listen to me, and maybe they'd
Yeah.
rather listen to their friends and peers, especially when we hit that teenage era?
Sure. Well, they are going to want to listen to their teens and their peers, and they likely may not want to listen to you. Hopefully, if you've been somebody who's been safe to talk to, relatively non-reactive, there still is a place in most children, if that hasn't been hurt too much, where they want your approval. They want to know you're proud of them. They want to, you know, they do want to see you as a resource to some degree. But I'll often say to parents, find other people that they think are cool, that are in their 20s or early 30s, that can be stand-ins for you, right? Who are, they're cooler than you, they're younger than you, whatever, and find those people in your community. It could be a niece or nephew of a good friend, it could be whatever, you know, and vet them, obviously, if you don't already know them really well. But see if they can also be a resource, an adult resource to your child through those teens and early 20s. And then they can turn around and be that to some other little one.
Oh,
Yeah.
I love that. Basically, adopt the cool aunt to come on.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. We have one in our family who is, she's planning on being the cool and a little subversive aunt. And that's just fine.
That's my job too now.
Yeah. It's a needed job. It's a great
Yes.
job.
Um, that being said, as the cool aunt,
Yeah.
how do you counteract the effect of societal conditioning? Because again, I mean, you can come up in such a healthy like household and have some wonderful community in your life, but when the mass majority of people are so wayward and you are constantly being checked and countered, and the ignorant masses are screaming much louder than the kind messages that you receive. I know that sometimes, just as a measure of cognitive survival, we tend to remember more the damage that is done to us and those
Mhm.
shameful messages and those harmful messages. And they sometimes overtake or try to overtake
Sure.
that brain
Yeah.
space. How do you thrive? How do you continue to foster that, for not just for others, but for yourself as a youth growing up in that
Yeah.
positive environment?
Well, I don't want to create the idea that kids are going to come through adolescence or their 20s for that, even that unscathed. They're not in the culture we have created here. It's a very toxic culture. But I also want to emphasize that if the foundation that they get and the people in their lives are primarily trustworthy and there for them, that is the still small, quiet voice that will prevail. So while they're going to have times where life is going to ask them to survive hard things, find their own inner resources, all of it, heal, maybe do therapy, whatever the deal is, right? That if they've had those people in their lives, you will see that that's the through line that will emerge in their 20s, in their 30s, like you were always there and I knew I could come back to that, and now I'm developing it more even for myself. And I've seen that in all four of our kids. They didn't come through unscathed and they had people to talk to, but they also knew a resilience inside themselves that they could reach into. And that resilience was fostered along the way by the continuity of people that were in their lives who loved them just as they were, right? Didn't need for them to perform, didn't need for them to do, let them have their ups and downs, and just said, you'll come through this, believed in them, right? And so you've got to be able to, I think, as a parent or an aunt or whatever, you've got to be able to roll with it with them. Like, I know this hurts, man. I had some yucky times too. I am here for you. What can I do? What would support look like right now for you? And how can I provide that? And you just stand with them. You're just with them.
I love that. Absolutely. And that makes so much sense because, like you said, we can't avoid adversity. But when you create a strong foundation and a stellar tool set, you'll
Mhm.
be able to digest those experiences in a much healthier way, and in a community that feels safe and nurturing to do so within. And I feel like a lot of us who grew up in the States didn't have that. And that's why we see so many of these problems. And that's
Mhm.
why people like me exist now to help people
Exactly.
navigate through that. Um, that this has been So wonderful. And I definitely want to pick up a copy of that book. I have it on my list, my Audible list, to
Yeah.
page through. Before we wrap up here, it went so fast and I loved everything I learned. What other takeaways do you personally feel are important to mention regarding this topic? Like any of it, shame, parenting, anything.
Yeah. I would say I mean, just so much of it I think is in the Shameless book. And if you did grow up through the 80s and 90s and onward, the Sex God and Conservative Church book might help you, give you some perspective as well. But I think when you stop and think about how beloved do I believe I am, how worthy of love and belonging and joy and happiness, how much do I believe I deserve just for being me? Or how much do I see that I am a unique expression of divine creativity and beauty? Like, if you think about that and you're like, yeah, no way can I get anywhere close to that, I want you to know that that's shame.
Mhm.
Because when you were little, you believed that. You know, when you were itty bitty, when you were 2, you believed that. You didn't think about it. It just was true. You just were, unless somebody had already started to squish that in you. This is our core nature. Our core nature is beloved.
Mhm.
We are so incredible as humans. And I remember saying to one of my granddaughters the other day, do you know there's never been another person just like you walked this earth, and this earth has been around a long time? Like, you are that incredible, right? Every single person is, yeah. But if it feels like you question that, then I would say pick up the Shameless book and start there. Just start shedding that, because I want for people to live their most liberated, authentic, appreciative life that they can, so that when they are on their deathbed, whenever that is, they look back and they're like, it was a good life. It was a good life because I allowed myself to soak it all in, soak in the beauty and the magic and the miracle of it. We have to get out of our own way sometimes to do that. And that's kind of part of what I'm talking about there.
I also wanted to add to those questions, if you can see the value in yourself outside of your utility to others
Yes.
and things. Because sometimes we'll be like, yeah, I'm cool. I help this person, that person. I'm like, awesome. But outside of what you do for others,
Yes.
like, do you like you? And
Yeah.
I see people balk at that question. And
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. It is at the center and heart of it is shame. We weren't born thinking that way. And somewhere along the route, it got all muddled. And
It did.
but the good news is it doesn't have to remain that way.
That's
And
right.
there are so many tools, so many good voices, so many good resources out there, your work among them, that help detangle those knots
Yeah.
in our hearts and get back to the core of that joy and
Yes.
existence.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. This was so wonderful. My heart feels so light now.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. This was a fabulous conversation.
I appreciate you. And if you want to find Dr. Tina's work, you can find her on Instagram at Dr. Tina Shameless and her website, www.tinaschermersellers.com, which I will put somewhere in the show notes as well. Uh, Thank you so much. I hope you will be back and we can have wonderful conversations again. And until next time, friends, if you want to see me, look for me at Ask Addie Adler on Instagram or www.askaddieadler.com for the rest of it. Thank you, Sex Explorers. Until next time, enjoy.